I am excited to introduce Laura Niemi, who serves as the Community Gardens Program Coordinator for the City of Portland, Oregon's Parks and Recreation Community Gardens Program.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. Hey, Sandy.
Hey, Laura.
My good friends up in Seattle, it's nice to see you. I'm going to be talking about the Portland Community Garden Program today, which is, I think, in many ways very similar to what's going on up in Seattle. So I have a little presentation I'll put together for you, and oh my goodness, here we go. I'll go through some slides and hopefully have time at the end for some questions. So our program was established in 1974. We have 59 gardens right now, and our goal is to have a garden within a mile of every household in the city of Portland. So we just recently did a planning survey and realized we need to add at least 22 more gardens. Of course, we don't necessarily have funding or land to do that, but that's our planning goal. We generally do try to add 1 to 2 gardens per year because there's just a lot of demand for community garden plots in Portland and a lot of support for the program, which is really exciting. One of the really cool things I'll mention about what the city of Portland does is whenever we add a new park, new trails, or a new community garden, any sort of asset like that, it's understood that additional funds are needed to care for those resources. And so we put in a request for operations and maintenance funding every time we add a new garden. The rate that has been calculated is $1.25 per square foot. And so, based on the size of the garden, there's a lump set aside that we go to city council and ask for, and by and large, they award it to us. And so that doesn't all come to the community gardens program, that goes to the various groups that do work in community gardens, like the irrigation staff or the fencing crews, et cetera. But it's a great way to ensure that the program isn't just growing and growing without receiving additional resources. A little bit about the folks that participate in our program. So we have about 70% folks identify as white. So it is, primarily white community, which is reflective of the demographics in Portland. However, we've done quite a bit of put a lot of time into connecting with communities of color, and specifically immigrant and refugee communities. We have 26 languages spoken in the program and have put a lot of time, especially into language access and ensuring that all of our materials are available in the various languages spoken. When somebody signs up for a garden plot, we make sure to track, what their preferred language is so that we can be sending correspondence or making phone calls with an interpreter in that language. A third of our gardeners last year received scholarship support to cover the plot fees. So we do charge a fee for garden plots, which ranges based on the size. And we do renewing gardener registration in the fall and then new gardener registration in the spring. So based on our renewing gardener registration for the 2021 garden season, we've seen a 14% increase in people requesting financial support with their plot fees. And so, we believe that's a direct connection with COVID. And much like other programs, our folks up in Seattle, we have a very long wait list. So every winter, usually every January, we contact everybody on the wait list and just confirm their interest. So we just did that. So we know everybody that's on the wait list is still interested in a plot. And so we have 1,370 individuals on the wait list, but only 400 plots across our system that are open, which is a smaller ratio than what we've had in the past. So people are keeping their plots. One of the cool things that I wanted to mention is in 2018, we added the native gathering garden to our community garden portfolio. So this is an 8-acre garden that was designed by and for the Native American community. And so this garden is not a plot rental garden. It is a collective gardening model. And it includes several large and small gathering spaces, various plantings of native and culturally significant plants. And there's also programming that is associated with that. And so this is a garden that is in process. It opened in 2018 with some infrastructure, but we have funding to continue to develop the garden in collaboration with community over the next 3 years or so, however long it takes really. So we're still looking at perhaps adding covered structures, adding additional plant material, making sure that the pathways are accessible for folks that used wheel mobility devices and elders. So it's a really cool and dynamic program or garden. So in terms of the garden space, 50% of our community gardens are on parkland. So they might be within a park, and some of them are standalone properties that the Parks Department manages. I don't know if I mentioned this now, but so I work for Portland Parks and Recreation, and we are a subsidiary of the city of Portland. So part of the Parks Department here. So 50% are on parks land, 25% are on school district land, and there are 4 different school districts that serve the city of Portland. And we have gardens on, I think, 3 of the districts host community gardens. And then, again, 13% are on private property, most often churches, and then 12% on other city property. So there might be with, sometimes we have, water treatment plants or water retention areas. Sometimes, our Department of Transportation has land that, used to be planned for a street and didn't go through. So we put a garden there instead. And in all of those cases, we don't pay rent for the cost of the use of the space. In the situation of private property, if the land is taxable, if they're churches don't receive or don't have to pay taxes, but like some, individuals have property taxes, we can apply for an exemption for them. So that's sort of their financial benefit to allowing us to use the space. But in exchange, we may do all of the maintenance on the land. So in terms of our program, we have 6 full-time staff and 3 part-time staff. And one of those staff members is dedicated just to the native gathering garden. So she does tending parties. She works with the community-based steering committee that makes decisions about the program and does programming and community outreach, community events. So we have 5 staff that work in the plot rental aspect of our program. And one of those is a new position that we just got approval for with that funding that we've received from adding new gardens. So if anybody is thinking about moving to Portland or interested in a career change, we will be having a posting for this garden coordinator probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So keep your eyes out for at portlandoregon.gov/jobs. That's where it will be posted. We also have volunteer garden leadership. So at each site, we try to have, we have formal or informal garden leaders. Sometimes it's just one person. Most of the time we encourage people to have there to be a group of leaders just so that there's, just more input from gardeners and more perspectives. Oftentimes, when there's just one person making decisions, it's really not reflective of what, all of the gardeners want. And as we have, various languages spoken in gardens, we try to find a leader from each language group when possible to be sure that they're part of the leadership team so that all of the decisions and messages are getting into the various language groups. But we do provide additional support for our leaders with language access. And these leaders are unpaid. So I know there was a question earlier about, whether people receive stipends. We also, so they're not paid, they're volunteers. And gardeners, the individual gardeners that rent plots are, as part of our policies, required to contribute 6 service hours per year. So that's care for their garden. It may be support for a fellow gardener, anything that is supporting their garden community. And so in 2019, we had 19,000 service hours contributed. So this is, like many garden models, this is how a lot of the the maintenance happens. This is how people, when they're ill or they're on vacation, have folks that can help, support them and their gardens. We have yard waste service here in the city of Portland for single-family homeowners, or single-family homes, I should say, but not for folks that live in apartments. And so oftentimes people will get their service hours just by taking home plant wastes from gardeners that don't have access to yard waste facilities. And in terms of COVID-19 accommodations, I know this was the question that came up earlier too. And, we sort of did the basic, stay home if you're sick, keep the 6-foot physical distance, wear masks, wear gloves. We didn't close any of our gardens. And, we made sure to have signage at each site with the guidance, and had, in all of the languages spoken in our program, so that everybody was, could receive this really critical health information. And also the signs, had photos so that folks with low literacy could also get this important information. We did modify events, so we canceled events in the spring. We generally do, gardener meetings every spring, and we had to unfortunately cancel those. But towards the end of the garden season, so late summer and fall, we were able to start doing small, garden gatherings or work parties with no more than 10 folks, with RSVP list, sign up ahead of time so we know who's coming. And then, of course, making sure all the tools were cleaned and sanitized. So there wasn't a lot of that going on, because I think people were still pretty, worried about their health, and we want to support that. And then I think the biggest thing for us was just really taking a trauma-informed approach to how we operate our program within COVID, understanding that so many people are going through really, really hard, really traumatic times. And so, for example, one of the, I think, most important garden policies is we ask people to use their garden plots to make sure that they're in use. And if they're not, we have other folks that want to use that space. And so it was, reaching out to each individual gardener that, that had plots that were unworked, to find out, what's their situation, what kind of support do they need, and connecting them with resources, whether it's other people in the garden who might be looking for, extra, looking for a way to get their service hours and wanting to help people in the community, letting their garden plots be used for growing and donating produce. In some cases, people, especially earlier in the season, it was really hard to find plant starts and seeds. And so in some situations, it was just providing people with materials so that they could get started. And really, with a program our size, we do rely a lot on electronic communications. But this year, we really spent a lot more time with doing phone calls and that person-to-person communication, because again, when people are in this heightened state, getting a letter about, your unworked garden plot can be really triggering for folks. And again, everybody has their specific situation. And so spending more time making direct phone calls to people and talking through kind of options has been really helpful. So I'll leave it at that, and be available for questions.
Thanks, Laura. So we already have a series of questions. The first one is, how do you identify land for new community gardens?
So in a lot of ways, the city of Portland owns a lot of land, especially the Parks Department. We have a lot of land that is purchased but hasn't been developed for a park. And so we did a planning study recently to identify, land that was appropriate for gardens. So, sunny, flat, accessible from transit, et cetera. And so that identified probably a dozen or so properties that could work for us. And so that's one way. As I mentioned before, school districts are a really big partner for us. And so oftentimes, they'll come to us and say, hey, we'd really love to have a community garden at our school, or we know this school has one and we want to have one too. And so oftentimes it is, you know, through those relationships that happen. And sometimes we reach out and say, hey, you know, we'd love to have a garden in your neighborhood. We see you have this big chunk of, you know, lawn. Would you be willing to host a garden? And then, yeah, I think for the private properties, most often those are people contacting us to say, hey, you know, we have the space at our church. We'd like to have a garden. And because we have limited resources to be able to build gardens, we really kind of go back to that planning study that says, you know, we want to have a garden within a mile of each household. But we also overlay that with equity criteria and really are prioritizing building gardens in areas where folks have lower incomes, where there's more communities of color, where there's more multifamily housing. And so geographically in Portland, that's the area of East Portland. And so that's really been where we've been building all of our gardens for the past couple of years.
That's a good segue to the next question. So besides financial support and language access, what other strategies have been implemented to diversify the gardens?
So I think a lot of it focuses on the outreach that we do. So because we have these long waiting lists and we don't have a lot of available space, you know, whenever we have that available space, we really try to do targeted outreach within communities, you know, surrounding the gardens. And so looking at, you know, what are the demographics of this neighborhood, you know, who is missing from this program, who is not being represented in this garden, and trying to do targeted outreach. And that might be with schools or after school programs have been a strong connection for us, or oftentimes there are, you know, specific community-based organizations that have events, you know, that we can come and speak to folks or have a table at. And then oftentimes also just using the relationships of folks that are in the garden, just letting people know, hey, you know, we have extra space and we're looking for, you know, we want to make sure that people know about this and know how to get involved. And then I think a really big thing that we've done too, because, you know, I think like many programs, there's a lot of pressure to, you know, bring in revenue. And even though we get extra money every time we build a garden, you know, that process or that policy didn't start till 2010. And so like many programs, we're still very much understaffed for the amount of work that we need to do. And so, oh my gosh, I totally lost my train of thought there. Anyways, I think really it's just, you know, focusing the resources that we have in the priority areas. You know, who are we trying to get into this garden? What support do they need? Oh yes, I remember now. It was about scholarships. So trying to reduce the cost of gardens and really make our scholarship process as easy as possible for people. So we don't require proof of income. It's just, you know, people tell us this is what my income is, and this is how much, you know, how many people are being supported on this. And so that's really allowed us to increase access to folks that have limited incomes. And I think that's made a big difference for us.
You also say that many garden groups have built relationships with schools and youth programs. So there's someone asking, how do you get teachers and youth leaders interested in participating in the garden?
So most often the schools are already on board with that. You know, there's a couple of organizations within Portland, nonprofit organizations that provide garden education. So that's their thing. They go into schools, they bring the educators and the curriculum. And so it's not extra work that the teachers have to do. And by and large, that's been a very popular program and people are really interested in that. And so, you know, in the situation, we have about 15 gardens that are on school district property. In, I think, all but one of those situations, there is an area of those gardens that is allocated specifically to the school or school gardening. And so again, in almost all of those cases, it is this third-party organization that is providing that educational support. So I think that's been the thing that has really worked for us here, the model that's worked really well.
Thanks, Laura. That's all the time we have for this Q&A. We're gonna move the conversation to Slack.